Allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, public comment. Nobody has approached either the clerk or myself. So we will move on to the approval of the minutes from the November 11th meeting. What are your wishes? Moved by Supervisor Lemmer. Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. For the record, all members are present with Supervisors Poole and Reynolds being remote and everybody else being here. All those in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. We'll jump to 6A1. Approve keeping a tax deed parcel for Wisconsin surplus listing at Parks Department's request.
So, Mr. Chair, I think I'll kick it off, and then Corp Counsel and certainly Jamie Polly from the Parks Department can talk this through. But kind of to begin, and I apologize I didn't put a memo in your packet on this, but it occurred to me yesterday as I was getting ready for this, in light of the changes that came from 2023 Wisconsin Act 207, as well as the Tyler v. Hennepin County case. I know we've talked about there are some areas of our ordinance that don't necessarily align with those two things, and I think this is one of those. So your ordinance requires Kim to reach out to all county departments to go through the recently acquired by the county tax delinquent properties through our in-rem process. And she did that. Great job, Kim. And one of the things that through that ordinance, it calls for Kim to do that. Department heads look at it and try to identify whether there are parcels that strategically make sense for the county to retain ownership of. Kudos to Jamie. She looked at it and said, hey, where there's a lot of talk about the West Side Master Plan that the county board has adopted and renovation potentially of or reconstruction of new ice sheets. And this is adjacent to that area that perhaps it makes sense for the county board to retain ownership of that parcel. And I'll let Jamie in just a couple minutes give you a high-level overview of kind of what I just alluded to. But like I said, I think it's an artifact, and I'll turn to Corp Counsel in just a minute, of a process that existed before that Supreme Court case. We can't just keep it for our own use, because you'll recall that case that we talked about. Essentially, the Tyler v. Hennepin County case says that if there's value in excess of what the county is owed through the tax delinquent process, that value is the property of the owner of that property, so we need to confer that back to them. Well, that makes a lot of sense in the statute when we turn around and sell it, because there's dollars we can hand back. But I think the same logic applies that if we retain it, there is still an inherent value in that property. So we would need to, in essence, if we were going to retain it, we would need to quote unquote buy it from ourselves. My thought process, and again, this isn't overly developed, but talking briefly with Mike, we would get an appraisal to essentially establish fair market value and then look at what was owed on the tax delinquent side and write a check for the difference. And Mike can elaborate if there's anything I'm missing, but I wanted to start with just have Jamie give you, again, 2 minutes of, hey, this is the parcel, and I'll pull it up on our GIS maps. And you can see the Marathon Park site there, and I believe that is the parcel right there that I've highlighted, if we can show this screen, but it's 1105 West Street. For those of you that are in the room, you'll see it, and if you're joining by WebEx, you should see it on the shared screen. But 1105 West Street is pretty close, just to orient yourself. Directly to the north of that, I think, is the old, that looks like a building is there, but
That's the Ironworks building. That
Yeah,
is
the
there.
Ironworks is directly north, a little bit to the west, still looks like buildings, but those,
That's cool.
that's where we leveled the cold storage, right? So with that brief orientation, Jamie, do you want to talk through kind of your thoughts on why it might make sense, or why you at least want the county, this committee to kind of review this?
Yeah. So as the 2021 was the West Side Master Plan was adopted by the county board, and it talks about redevelopment of the area along West Street, specifically from where we took the cold storage building down to 17th Avenue if the highway department were to be relocated. I know all of that is still in the works, and we don't have a specific plan on here. And ideally, if that Ironworks building or lot would ever sell, that the county in that West Side Master Plan would also retain that and expand, a lot of the recreation services down along West Street, including the ice arena as well as a turf fields or grass fields, the pickleball being relocated out of there, so that then the West Side Master Plan part of the park and getting all the gravel out of there and making it safer and more of a community park feel rather than a high-speed highway of gravel. Kind of all looks in that vision. So when I look at these parcels, usually none of them ever pertain to a park or a vision that we have. But this one kind of stuck out just in it with its adjacency to West Street. With that long-term plan, that area could be redeveloped. One thought is if the highway department doesn't move or takes longer to move and we do relocate an ice arena at some point, the current spot it could go is where it is green, where that cold storage building was taken down. And in its current form, that lot would fit the arena and some parking, but not enough parking that would be adequate for the arena. So this is a thought that this lot could be just an overflow parking area in the meantime until either the highway department would move, the Ironworks is acquired, or, we have talked about talking with Quick Trip across the street. They have an acre grassy area that could be additional parking as well. So it's not necessarily absolute ideal where I feel like it's an absolute necessity that I recommend that you keep it. It's just in that general vicinity, so it's long-term, which could be, 3 years, 5 years, 20 years. Just something that before it went for sale, thought that we could kind of consider. And I think it all would depend upon, too, what that cost estimate would be and what the county would have to pay for it. If it's too much, maybe the value is not there. But just with that long-term vision, thinking that this could be a usable spot for whatever we develop along West Street.
All right, and Mike, anything I missed on again, this isn't well developed, but my thought is we'd essentially go through that appraisal process to buy it.
No, I think you laid it out well. Really, the analysis now after that Hennepin County case and some of the changes in state law is anytime we acquire a tax delinquent property, we have to analyze what value the county gained, whether that's by selling it or whether that's by retaining it. And the best way to determine the value of something that you're retaining would be an appraisal to get that fair market value, and then analyze, what impact retaining it would be on, how much we would have to cut the check to the former owner. So, no, I think you hit everything.
And of course, if we do retain it, like Jamie said, this isn't one where, from the staff perspective, I don't think we're saying, oh my gosh, this is an amazing opportunity once in a lifetime, but we want to, we're working through our ordinance. Again, Kim did what she's supposed to do. Jamie did what she's supposed to do. And it's just operationally different than what we might have to do in the past. And of course, if you ask us to go through the appraisal process and bring you back information, nothing is stopping you from turning around and selling it thereafter. I apologize that it's not more developed than that, but wanted to at least bring that information to you.
So Kim, you've done some research relative to the assessed value in the amount of back taxes on this.
So the assessed value of that parcel is $34,100. The outstanding taxes are $26,151.40. So got a little bit of a difference there.
Sorry, can you
That's
say that again?
assessed versus appraised, so.
Sure, the assessed value is 34,100, and the outstanding taxes are 26,151 and 40 cents.
Chair Gibbs.
Is this a residential property or is this just a vacant lot? Just a vacant lot, okay. Does the 15140, does that include any allocation for additional takings? Or in other words, is that just the tax and interest and penalty?
That's just the tax, interest, and penalty. It doesn't include any of our
Fees and stuff
fees
that
or
we-
time or anything, no.
Okay.
Chair Gibbs.
Well, in light of, the potential difference, I think it is imperative if we're going to remove it from or potentially remove it from the sale, we need to find out whether or not the assessed value is very close to the appraised value. So I would recommend that we get an appraisal first before we make a determination to know what our difference is, to know whether or not there's value in keeping the property off of the property tax rolls.
So I think the clerk's intention was to list this with surplus property, which sort of moved the property. This is one where I think we've owned it for a couple of years, so it's not one of the recent NREM. Or it is one of the recent. So why, okay. Then I misspoke. Okay, so it is one of the new NREM. So we have some statutory timeframes. Mike, are you familiar with those, or Kim, in terms of our needing to act within time certain relative to parcels?
My understanding is that the current time frame is 270 days, and there's an upcoming change that wouldn't apply to this parcel that lowers it to 180 days. But I believe right now the presumption is we have 270 days to turn around and determine what we're doing with this parcel or divest ourselves of it. And that's 270 days from the actual acquisition, which was 240, which was September 25th or thereabouts.
So there was nothing in the packet. I know that Supervisor Marshall had contacted me looking for additional information. I think we now have that, but what are your wishes? I think the options are to request an appraisal, not to take any action relative to acquisition, request an appraisal for determination of value, postpone, or allow it to go to sale. Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I know there's also an initiative to make sure that the lots that are within the city that can be made into housing is one of our initiatives as well. So that kind of makes it, is that property large enough to put a single-family home on?
Did you think there was a house on there, Jamie, or?
No, currently there's just some storage of trucks and stuff on there. So
I don't know if it
Yeah.
used to be a,
yeah.
I don't know. But it looks like in a residential area. I can zoom in. It looks like a larger lot than the other lots that are adjacent to it that are housing. So I would surmise that it could be rezoned for housing just based on the fact that I zoomed in again haven't done additional research, but it's the one that I've highlighted right in the corner there, and there's single family housing in that whole area.
Yeah, and those are tractor trailers that are on there, so it is larger.
Yeah.
Chair Gibbs, you have a,
Yeah, I guess I would make a motion to have the property appraised and then determine, that way we can make a determination of whether or not there's value in retaining it, or at least what the difference is that we would owe the former owner of the property.
So is that a second? Is there a second to Supervisor Lemmer, seconded Chair Gibbs' motion? Supervisor Lemmer.
Has Wausau been approached to see if any of their committees are interested in seeing if this is developable in housing?
So when I'm required to send a notice to the departments, I'm also required to send that notice to the municipalities. And that deadline expires today, and I have not heard anything from the city at all.
I think that's another area, again, our ordinance predated, of course, some of the processes within our ordinance predated the Hennepin County case. I think also our ability to transfer to a municipality that has expressed interest. Historically, we had done that, but again, the underlying premise of that Tyler v. Hennepin County case would similarly control our ability to do that, whereas if a municipality wanted to acquire the property, we'd need to make sure that that transaction got fair market value for that property because, again, the preceding owner would be entitled to that. But I likewise have not heard anything from the city of Wausau regarding their interest.
So we have a motion on the floor to obtain an appraisal with the intent of evaluating that appraisal for future action for the county. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor of the motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? That motion carries. So that will come back here at a future date. I would ask in the future where we have these, if we can get a memo written up with some information with the intent, the amount the county has invested, the assessed value, and going forward, just so we've got something to look at. My understanding too is that the highway department also contacted you after the 30 days relative to another parcel in Rib Mountain. And
I
well,
think we're going to put that on the agenda for the next meeting.
and I think we would have a similar request. Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It appears that we should go through our ordinance and make changes, and maybe we could put that on next month's agenda. Thank you.
Great suggestion. Thank you. All right, we will move on to the claim disallowance. Mike.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a claim that was sent by an insurance company on behalf of their insured who drove over a manhole cover which came loose and hit the vehicle. Our insurer is recommending denial of that claim. In order to be successful on a claim against the government in this type of situation, the government entity would have to have actual notice of the state of the manhole before the incident happened and have some negligence in how that all happened. And there's no proof of actual notice and really none of that evidence. So our insurer determined there's no liability. I would support that at this time as well.
Can I ask a question, given the fact that it was a manhole cover, which is an obligation of the local unit of government, when that local unit of government was quick to kick it to us as a responsible party, where is our responsibility as it relates to utility appurtenances or whatever you want to call them in the right-of-way of county trunk highways?
It's a good question. The roadway itself would be under county responsibility. The maintenance of the utilities probably is local municipality responsibility. The manhole cover could be, if we're looking at finger pointing, the finger could point either way. If there was notice that this condition existed and a failure to correct it and actual negligence on one of the parties. So that's a very good point. That I think another solid reason for denial is that it's not clear that the county had any maintenance responsibility over this particular item.
Are there any questions of Corporation Counsel? Not, what are your wishes? Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to deny the claim of Brittany Teskey consistent with our insurance recommendations.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Hart. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. Approve October claims and question cost. That was sent out yesterday in both regular format and an Excel spreadsheet format. We'll try to get those out sooner in the future. Sam, do you want to just?
First and foremost, I apologize for the delay in the reports. I did rerun the third quarter September report so that everything should be up to date as of today. We are still working on a lot of system cleanup. One thing to note, though, that's everything looks to be in alignment for that time of year, with the exception of the grants fund. It's saying that it's at
If we can, I think we're in claims and cost.
sorry.
Save that for the educational programs.
My apologies. Underneath the claims, I've been trying to find a report that runs, the initial report that I gave you would run off of the accounting date. So I found a check register report, but it looks like it is missing the ad hoc payments. And then EFTs that are missing are payroll transactions that are in there and expense reimbursements. I am currently working with IT to find a better report so that I can give you guys a valuable report in the future. Is there any questions on anything that was on the report that I can answer?
I just have a comment, and
Okay.
I'd be negligent if I didn't, but
Yes.
just like to point out that in this batch of payments, we're paying WPS $155,028.55. We're making payments to We Energies, and we're making $112,654 of payments plus to Wausau Water Works. And I think this committee talked about our utility cost as part of the budget assumption debate, and we lowered the assumption, but I know that we had an energy grant that came in at the last board meeting, but I would hope that we would give a lot of emphasis, if you could, as, you know, we're budgeting over $2 million for utilities for the county, and I think that's an area where we may be able to realize some savings, particularly if we take advantage of some of the focus on energy and other things, and I would hope that we would continue to look at that. So just a comment relative to observing the claims. Any other questions? If not, what are your wishes? Motion to accept and place on file would be in order. Chair Gibbs.
Make a motion to approve the October claims and question costs.
Is there a second? Seconded by Supervisor Lammert. Any discussion? Any discussion? If not, all those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, no. That motion carries unanimously. All right, approve Wisconsin Public Service easement for Marathon Park. Mike, is that you?
It certainly can be. This is a request for an easement relative to gas line infrastructure that we received from Wisconsin Public Service. I don't know from reviewing the materials whether this is new or existing infrastructure. I don't know if, Chris, you know anything about that?
Excuse me, based on the conversation I had with the gentleman from WPS, this is an area that previously had been taken for potential road development, but wasn't ultimately taken for that. So when WPS had looked at that previously, they didn't really. Oh, we're on Marathon Park?
Yes.
Apologies. This one, the red T you see there, I don't know exactly where they're coming in, but it looks like they're going to come through underneath the railroad. This is actually useful for the county in this particular parcel because currently the nearest gas access point is further down Garfield, which was discussed with UW about separate projects earlier in the year. But what this gets is a gas line into that area that doesn't have to squeeze through a piece of land that we couldn't get anybody to bore through because of the railroad easement and everything else jammed in there. So this wasn't requested, but it is, timely in a sense based on the conversations I had previously, because this is also in a TIF. And because of the city's situation with their TIFs, you can't amend property lines or combine parcels. So that complicated the bringing in of utilities or trying to pipe off a different building. So this provides another entrance for the utility into this area that wasn't previously there.
So do you know, have we shared this proposed easement with the Agricultural Society, given the fact that they have an interest in the property?
No, I don't believe so because this is the first I've seen of it.
And these are permanent easements, so if we were to change the use, our ability to build above within that easement would be restricted? Or not?
Yes.
Yes, that's what So do you feel, is there an obligation for us to consult with the Marathon County Agricultural Society on the use of the park?
I don't know that there's a legal obligation. I also don't think anything prevents you from doing so.
Yeah. If I might, I don't see a problem with the T part coming if that's following the road, because that's still part of the long-term plan. And the first part of the north-south piece probably is not an issue either, because the exhibition building and the showing arena and the one cow barn are national on the National Registry for Historic Sites, so they can't be changed or moved. It would be interesting to know, I guess, from our standpoint, more details on where it's coming close to that rink too. If it could stay within that roadway where a roadway can still go over it, I think then it's not a hindrance to the park. But if it's right up next to that building, knowing what our issues are with our rinks, that could potentially be a hindrance.
So is the request at our request to provide service to the park, or is it to create a loop for the utility? Do we know?
It was not our request.
So as such, I'm going to ask a question. Is there any remuneration to the county associated with the granting of the easement?
There was none offered at this time.
Chair Gibbs.
Do we know if it's time sensitive or not? What rationale or reasoning is the need for it, as you had indicated?
No, there's no answer to that in terms of timeliness. This is one that just came to us and, excuse me, just came through the process as part of the standard, how do we discuss easements with the county and people like WPS. So we could certainly reach back out with questions people have, or like the questions we raised earlier, to find out more. But what's in the packet is what we received.
Any other questions or comments? Supervisor Marshall.
I think the questions raised, we would be good to get those answers before we make any decisions, including if it is a request from the entity, if there would be numeration. Thank you.
So could we direct staff to engage Wisconsin Public Service in discussions relative to purpose, gather additional information and find out if there's any ability to receive payment and report back to us at an upcoming meeting.
Staff understands the, the desire for that information. We'll bring it back.
All right. And I think it would be just as a courtesy to reach out to the Marathon County Agricultural Society for their input into it as well, just as a good neighbor. Anything else on that? If not, we'll move on to the easement on North 28th Avenue in the Village of Maine. Mike and then Chris.
This is another easement request we received. Chris has more information on it, so I will not talk anymore.
So based on the conversation I had with the gentleman, this is something that they had looked at years ago, and the county had taken the land for some road development that didn't take place. And so earlier WPS had thought, well, they're going to use it for their purposes, so then they weren't going to ask. But now with their planning and some apparent change from their perspective in terms of how this was used, they're basically approaching the county for the easement as sort of a stopgap in a way. It's not a make or break for them, but it helps facilitate the work they're looking to do in that area.
So this is part of the 28th Avenue corridor that we had, I think the Infrastructure Committee and spent a lot of time looking at that. The decision was that in light of other developments that occurred in that area, there was no intent in the county to develop an alternative or extension of R, and that they were looking to the village for what their long-term plans were in terms of expanding and potential expansion of that road. But so we have that easement, or we own that property yet. And so the easement would be for gas line in that area again. And it's outside of the right of way, but within reasonable proximity to the right of way, I would assume. Any other questions? Supervisor Limmer.
If we are no longer interested in that area, why do we still have that property? Is there a way we could divest from it?
I can answer that. I actually met with Commissioner Griesbach on that. The county board a couple of years ago approved a decision-making process, whereas Committee Chair Robinson referenced, the county board said, we are no longer interested in what was termed as the 28th Avenue corridor project, but it turned to the two respective municipalities, both the City of Wausau and the Village of Maine, to say, if you are interested in these properties as part of the county board's decision-making process, you directed staff to reach out and wait to divest until we heard from those municipalities. We have been waiting, and I just met with Commissioner Griesbach again this week to talk about, we really need an answer from either the Village of Maine and or the City of Wausau on those parcels, but the short answer is we're stuck on that decision-making process, waiting for formal action was what the requirement from the county board was by each of those municipalities before divestment can take place. I don't anticipate the project happening, and Jim is going to continue to urge those municipalities to take that formal action. Quite honestly, if they don't, my conversation with Commissioner Griesbach was to bring back to the county board to change your decision-making process to say it's been long enough, let us move on to the next step.
Supervisor Marshall, follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In the county-owned parcels, it appears we have 40 right-of-way related road parcels that needed decisions. So do we have a specific time that we've given the municipalities that if it's been, say, more than 60 to 90 days, that we give them a deadline?
I don't know if it's 40 Are you saying it's 40 for the 28th Avenue project, or just 40 total throughout that the county owns of right-of-way?
This is from a previous board where it lists 40 in total for the county.
Okay.
I believe, but don't hold me to it, I believe that this would not be in that 40. I think that the right-of-way are more slivers or small portions versus parcels that were acquired. They were looking at one time at a significant rerouting because the, for lack of a better term, steepy, as we called it, the hill, rerouting the road and requiring additional parcels. So I don't, I could be wrong, but I don't think this falls under the definition of the right-of-way. But the issue is the same, nonetheless.
And I think you're, if I'm guessing, the list you're looking at is probably the list from Dave Mack when he came and did the breakdown. So I think I agree that these are likely not on that list. And the short answer on those is no, there was no timeline given. I just took all of that information and I disseminated it to all the municipalities to have them look at were there parcels that they were interested in. And I do have a number that I need to follow up on, but there was no timeline given on divestment. And then we would need to, for each of those, we would need to look how we acquired it, if it was for highway right-of-way, which it sounds like that's what you're talking about. There's a legal process for how you need to provide notice. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mike. It's adjacent landowners first. But this parcel you're talking about isn't on that list, I don't believe. Good questions, though.
So we do have two issues here, one which is agendized, which is the easement. The second one is what's the future of the parcel? And I think there's a process in play right now to determine what the long-term interest of that parcel is. Supervisor Lemmer.
So will granting this easement impact the future of a municipality taking it over, or the landowner or somebody nearby actually wanting it?
I don't know that I'm qualified to speak to this, but, and Chris, I don't know if you know, if there's not a utility gas line running in front of the property right now, I think it's reasonable that it could cut either way. As a landowner, I might be much more inclined to say, oh, the cost to connect now is reduced. Again, that assumes that there's not a line that would service that property already in that area. The flip side, of course, is any easement, as I think Chair Robinson has pointed out in previous easement discussions, there's always the question of, does it negatively impact your property right? Given the location of this and that it doesn't appear to be very far from the roadway, I would defer to your judgment on whether or not you think it's going to negatively impact it, because for mine, I'm probably not doing anything if I'm the landowner in that area.
Chair Gibbs.
Is the easement, how far from the center of the road does that easement go back?
I know that the materials in the packet provide that information. The drawing indicates it's not to scale, and the parcel description, the legal description, just references section numbers and not measurements off of roadway. Certainly, if anybody else, Mike or Chris, if you have better information.
It's hard to determine based upon the drawing because it says that the final exhibit will be provided at a later date. I would assume that this would be located as as close to the right-of-way as possible, but that's an assumption. And if it is not, that could have an impact on the value of the property. Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just make sure that a building could still be on there. Number 3 says that it guarantees that no structures will be erected in or in close proximity to the grantee's facilities. I'm not sure what the required setbacks are, but I just would hate to grant the easement and then make it non-buildable.
As long as we're having that discussion with WPS relative to Marathon Park, I think it might be appropriate for us to get a little bit more clarification as to what the scope of that easement is, understanding that they want to provide an exhibit at a later date, but they still must know where they are relative to the center line or with the existing right-of-way. So if we could get that information and bring that back at that same time. Is that consistent with Supervisor Marshall, your intent?
Yes, and if we could get what the appropriate setback would be, just to make sure that if someone did want to build on there, it would be available. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Does anybody object to that approach? Seeing consensus, we will request Corp, Counsel, and Deputy County Administrator pursue gathering of additional information relative to that request. All right, we will then move on to 7A, review of the 2025 budget process. And this is an exercise that we do every year after the budget has been adopted, is what went well, what could we improve on, what information would be helpful when we move ahead. And I would open it up for comments from the committee. What did you, I know that there's a desire to have additional financials, to have the budget a little bit earlier. We've talked about that, but are there other things that you would like to see relative to the 2026 budget process? Supervisor Limmer.
Apologies, I'm thinking out loud here, but it feels like some of us newbies, I will consider myself a newbie as well, just because I feel like I'm still trying to wrap my head around budgeting for a almost $200 million organization. But I wonder if it would be helpful at committee level to have more of a graphic showing these are the departments we have jurisdiction under, this is where the funding comes from, and kind of an analysis of those funding streams in more of a pictorial form than a spreadsheet or a oral presentation, just so it's easier for us to see then where could we, if needed, make adjustments. The other thing too is I've been looking at the budget, your budget address, Mr. Administrator, is amazing, and I think people didn't catch what you directed staff to do. They kind of, I felt like in some of the conversation, they made an assumption that you didn't direct staff, like on page 4 when you had talked about not having any expansions, and then later on, I think in page 12, you talked about what you did to actually balance the budget. Maybe those things could be put in a bigger font or more picture format, so it's clearer that this was not just a status quo, we're doing what we always did, but we worked to keep it status quo. It wasn't a given. I don't know if that makes sense.
Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a couple of thoughts on It will be helpful in the next budget if we have the audited annual financial or comprehensive financial report, because that does show sources and uses and gives a better, clearer picture of our reserves. So that will be super helpful. As well as just a comment that I know we have a process of the rollovers of the unused funds roll into CIP, which lends us to sometimes give a conservative approach on our revenues as well as a conservative approach on our expenses, with the thought that that then rolls over, which is always good. However, I would like to just say perhaps we could give a more realistic view of our revenues and expenses and just have a discussion about our CIP needs and rolling that into the budget. And then it's easier to then have a management strategy toward managing those expenses and reserves. It just seems more straightforward, is my opinion. Thank you.
I'm particularly interested in Supervisor Poole and Supervisor Reynolds' thoughts, because it's your first time through. What do you think we could do to improve it from your perspective in terms of education, information, process improvements?
For the most part, myself, still trying to absorb a lot of the process, and figuring it out. So there's certainly a learning curve for me on this.
Yeah, this is Supervisor Reynolds. I would agree with both Supervisor Lemmer and Marshall on, there's just a lot of moving parts, a lot of committees, a lot of people involved. So any way to, display that information with, the spreadsheets and that it's a ton of information to absorb. So any way we can improve that would be appreciated.
Couple of observations. I think we assume that people would go back and look at the Budget 101 from 2 years ago, and for the new members, that's a difficult process. So we talked about potentially, as we start the process, beefing up the Budget 101 and just repeat it, because when you're new or newer, it's a lot of information in a short period of time that isn't applied until 6 months later. And so I think we might want to look at what our educational programming could be for the entire board and laying that out. I think we're going to have the discussion later about fund balance policies and how do we build that in, following up on Supervisor Marshall's comments. And then I think that we need to have a better discussion too about what priorities and assumptions might mean going into the budget process. I think getting better clarification and understanding of what those mean. Supervisor Marshall.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think that an important piece of this is to get ongoing financials throughout, if we're discussing how we're doing performance-wise throughout the year, I think there will be fewer questions as to, well, where are we today and what are we budgeting in the future? So that's going to be a key part of it.
And I think Sam is working on that. If you'd like to comment.
Yeah. I do plan on bringing a monthly report in the future. I'm working on a couple of simplified versions to kind of give a snapshot overview, as well as, because this committee is the finance, giving you more of that year-to-date for all of the departments to give a little bit more contextual information to the overall performance. But I am most certainly open to any suggestions or feedback on those reports to make sure that I'm getting you guys what you need.
Just a question for you relative to mapping of expenditures and revenues. Do you feel like we have solved that problem, or are we still a work in progress as to which accounts to charge certain items to?
It's still a work in progress. However, we're getting more towards a better goal. We're working very hard on cleaning up some things, but I think 2025 is looking very promising of having good financial data that's mapped in the appropriate places and on a universal level around the county.
Chair Gibbs.
You know, the one the one area that I think we need to, and I think you've alluded to it, Mr. Chair, is, you know, when we set up the budget assumptions, and with the board voted on the budget assumptions, and then gave direction to administration to build the budget based on those budget assumptions, we need to, as a board, understand and acknowledge what those budget assumptions mean. If we sit there and tell administration to, one, not to use any reserves, and he builds the budget based on those assumptions, and then we want to change direction at a later point and use those reserves, that's fine. That board has that prerogative to do that. But then let's say that up front, that we don't want to, that we do want to use down reserves or spend down reserves. There's intention historically, and I think that needs to be brought into context. Historically, the board has provided in its policies, in its direction, it historically has budgeted conservatively on its revenues and conservatively in the reverse on expenses, and as by policy rolled over any unused into CIP to fund the CIP projects. That was intentional. That's by policy. And so if we want to effectively change direction as a board, that's fine. We can change that direction, but we need to own that change in direction and understand that we can have smaller reserves as long as we know what those impacts are. You know, what does that impact? How does that impact our bond rating? How does it impact our ability to respond to emergencies? And how does it allow us to respond to the capital needs that we have for the county in protecting the properties and the assets that the taxpayers own? It's clearly a direction, and some counties use that approach, and others use the approach that the county has had. But to switch back and forth, I don't believe is a long-term sustainable goal. But let's have that meaningful discussion. Let's clearly map out what we want to provide direction, and understand when those budget assumptions are made, that it's not something that you change at the last minute.
I would just request that as we engage our auditor in the development of the audit, in his presentation to this group, that he spend some time talking about where we are in the various funds, and spend a little bit more time in having that independent review of where we are with fund balances relative to our own internal policies and comparable institutions. And that's usually before we formally get into the budget process, and it might provide valuable information to drive the discussion on what those priorities and assumptions are. So if Sam and Lance, if in the context of engaging Baker Tilly, if you could just ask them for an expanded discussion on that.
Certainly, and I appreciate the discussion. I'm trying to take notes. And of course, as I reflect, I did have a couple of specific questions I wanted to ask, and I think, Chair, you got at one. My sense is the presentation venue. I presented the budget to this committee. But based on the discussion, I think, and this was my assessment as well, we'd be better served by having the full board, the delivery to the full board, to allow for a more robust delivery to the full board. We certainly appeared before the full board and there was discussion, but more of a back and forth relative to the actual delivery of the budget. Backing that up as well, I heard the discussion about to help do a better job of that education piece, to try to better underlie the what's going into the budget assumptions. I did have one very specific question. Is there a belief that there's a lot of value to including the mandatory discretionary program list throughout the budget building process? I did get good feedback in a couple of areas to expand some programs, but generally speaking, that mandated program list wasn't. It was helpful, I think, to start the conversation, perhaps for 1 month. But if there's things that you want in addition to that, I really like the idea of essentially a funding wheel by department for. It's going to be a summary because it's really by program, for example, within social services. It's not that every program is 2/3 non-county levy, but some are 100%. But we can do that. I like that a lot. But is the mandated discretionary program document something we hit early and then not put in the packets? Because it's long and I don't think it added a lot of value after the first discussion. Okay, I see some head shaking. Good, I'm not entirely off base. I really appreciate the idea of the reserve presentation because I think that is a very poignant one to have. It's, as you've all said, it's what is the strategy and let's own it and be very, very good at it. I also can reach out if you believe there's value. We adopted the St. Croix method a couple of years ago. And I know a couple of my colleagues use some other approaches relative to net new construction, for example. We know how much net new construction within, a plus or minus 15% probably, or 25%. We can probably tell you what that dollar amount is going to be, similarly with shared revenue. And we can engage the full board on what are your priorities with that. I mean, I can tell you, and I didn't do this during the budget process early enough, but 3% of your county levy payroll essentially eats up all of that new money, which is why health insurance is really important, which this committee knows. But if there are things you're hearing from your colleagues that, hey, this county has an approach that you've heard from your colleagues in other county, other supervisors, please let me know and I'll reach out.
Supervisor Lemmer, then Supervisor Marshall.
So just talking about those reserves, it would be, I think, helpful for all of us, me, I should not speak for everybody, so I'll just speak for me, to know where we were going before the amendments came to spend out of reserve, and now where are we going? I'd like to see what that impact is because I don't know that I really fully understood the projections of what those reserves were going to be used for, but now we need new projections. So having that projection would be helpful, and maybe even looking at the reserves over the last couple of years, what rolled into them, what was spent out of them. So we can really see those connections and connect those dots.
Sure. Yeah, Sam and I met, and one of the ideas we kind of are batting around, and so it's not very well developed, but is the idea of something tangible that supervisors can have that you flip open and it's, here are the county's various reserves. Here are reserve policies that are applicable. And so what are they for? How are they funded? How are they used? Similar to the memo, we tried to truncate a lot of that into that memo. But our hope is, our desired future state is to actually have something tangible, both we can hand you and you can have accessible online, that, hey, what is the general fund? What is funded by it? How is it utilized? What is our target? Why is that the target? Sam and I talked, and I know I'm not trying to jump ahead to 7B, but adopting some plain language approaches to what is our reserve, because when you read the reserve policy that was adopted in 1995 initially and see the calculation from 1995 that they utilized, they don't line up logically. The calculation has been done the same every year since that time, as I understand it. But plain language I mean, for me, I need a decoder ring sometimes to get through and that's not I mean, that's not a joke with that reserve calculation, because you read it and you think 8 1/3%, but that's not how that calculation is. They refer to it as a baseline factor and an after audit adjustment. I think we'd be better served, plain language, and we can get some other counties that, I know other counties have adopted plain language for their reserve policies. My sense, and don't hold me to this, is that your reserve targets, the numbers themselves, based on our expenditures, the actual dollar amounts as your targets, are solid dollar amount targets. But the verbalization of how you get those doesn't align well. So again, I don't want to jump ahead, but I appreciate the fund balance piece, and we can talk with John Rader about that, and I think Sam has some real good thoughts as well.
Supervisor Marshall.
Yes, I think one of the changes that we could possibly discuss is, I know we give a salary input increase. However, I'd like that to be a total compensation increase that takes into account the health insurance benefits. Because in the public hearing document, it did say that our health insurance expense increased by $880,000. So that is beyond the 3% that we had for salary. And we do have to acknowledge that we should be looking at total compensation. Thank you.
One of the things that I'd like to potentially monitor a little bit closer is that we tend to look at levy, because obviously we have limits and constraints, and that's what impacts the taxpayers. But we also had a goal of increasing our fees by 3%. And one committee in particular had an opportunity to look at that, and they passed on it. It would be helpful to look at just where are we relative to our increases, because if our costs go up for uniformly at 3%, but we don't get 3% with net new construction, we have to look to other sources of revenue, and I doubt that grants are going to increase. So we have to look at what the fees and others are. I'd like to track that a little bit more to make sure that we're staying current within all programs. I think some of the programs and departments have done a very good job of doing that. Others could use some attention, for lack of a better term. But I think it's important if we're going to have these costs, and we're looking at $59 million out of a $200 million budget coming from the levy, that means $141 million comes from other sources. We have to make sure those other sources are current, or make a conscious decision. And I don't know, too, I think it's important for us to look at where those, I think the administrator referenced, where are we with net new construction and shared revenue? How many of you realize that $1.4 million of the levy increase went to the sheriff's department? You know, when you look at it, we had some retractions in some departments in the general fund, but we really didn't talk about that in the overall context and we had supervisors say, well, it's easy to come up with cuts. Well, if you start looking at it, there's some reasons, but I think we need to have perhaps a better understanding where some of those significant increases of cost are. Not to say that it was not appropriate, but just to state the fact that we had a significant increase in one department. And, you know, is that necessarily would that be where we would spend our dollars if you were allocating all new dollars equally? And I think we need to do a better job of looking at where those impacts are on our levy and other sources.
Can I ask a specific question to your first comment about the fees? Did you find, I tried to work with departments to compile all those and put them in an appendix as opposed to embedding them in the individual departments. Is that perhaps a good tool? And you don't have to answer it today, but you can look at the budget book and look at that appendix of fees. We tried to include what is the current fee, what is the increase, or what is the fee for next year, and if there was an increase, we noted it. But I do like the idea of tracking those things on an ongoing basis, which is kind of why I adopted that format. Take a look at it. Let me know if that works. The other thing in speaking with HR Director Adzik, to Supervisor Marshall's point, I think adding an appendix that gets at our salary and wage grid so that every year I know it's available to you and you can all find it on our website, but I'm envisioning incorporating that in as an appendix as well with any modifications or changes to, for example, shift differential or anything like that. We'd have those flagged in that document so that, again, the board is making those formal decisions when you adopt a budget. If there are other things, kind of those, what I'll call the building blocks of a budget that you want as an appendix, I've largely looked at other counties to see how they do it and seen the ones that I think are high performing, and we pull those. But no need for an answer today on the fees, but it was a change in approach. And if there's anything else. But this is very helpful.
Anything else? Anything else? And I think we'll revisit this issue before we start the budget process again, so you've got a chance to reflect a little bit more and see where we are with some of the financials. Chair Gibbs.
I think one other thing that just occurred to me that I think that the board needs to at least analyze to some extent, because I think the one individual that develops the budget and has the most intricate knowledge of all of the needs throughout the county is where is there risks that the board that you would see if we chose to potentially continue to use reserves. Where do you see risks as far as the operation of the county, not specifically isolated to one department, but overall in what risks do you see, when you develop that budget?
Can I ask a follow-up? Would that be helpful, you think, in kind of the budget development process to have more of that conversation on the front end with the reserve discussion that Supervisor Marshall referenced, and revenue projection, and have essentially a risk assessment or health check of where are the areas of risk? I know when I made my budget presentation, I think that was 2 years ago, I expressly referenced, hey, here are the areas of risk. But it more in the presentation, early in the budget bill. Okay. No, I think, yeah, that's good. I can make any of those notes. And of course, if anything occurs to anybody after this, happy to take an email.
Supervisor Marshall.
With the addition of the person who will be hired to sell off our county-owned property, I assume that we could track that as money that, if it is held in our debt service fund, that could be used for next year's debt service requirement. Just so we have kind of a rolling number throughout the year. Hey, we've sold this many properties. We now have accumulated this amount in debt service that could then be used for next year's budget or for 2026.
Certainly, we can keep track of, and I know Sam had just found a couple of things we need to. I thought we had sold the property for Habitat for Humanity, but the closing date's in January. She corrected me on that. We have an agreement to sell at a later date. We can keep track certainly on the property, the proceeds from sales of property. And would it be helpful to have this committee adopt an express policy with regard to all property sales to handle those differently? You've done it, my recollection is you've done it on a property-specific basis. For example, the two community-based residential facilities that were sold, you specifically set those aside as part of the budget. This year's budget, there was an amendment that was offered that said that would be set aside for, don't hold me to the language, but debt service was at least one of the two things. There was one other, but it's not occurring to me. We can bring back and further develop your debt service fund policy, because right now, correct me if I'm wrong, Sam, the debt service reserve is really just an in and out for money purely to service debt. It's not a growing reserve where things are going into it other than debt levy and payments from transfers from North Central.
Correct. I think there's a little bit of like a reserve in there for like a contingency aspect of it, but it should just be in and out on an annual basis.
I think we would want those broken, the sale of surplus or excess property broken down into restricted versus unrestricted, because we have some, again, that we acquired through for certain purposes where we're limited relative to that. So as we begin to approach this issue, I think if we can just begin to say, these are the ones we really have control over those assets once the sales occur, and these are the ones we don't, and that would be helpful to us.
But I made a note when we do the presentation on the various funds, to your point, Supervisor Marshall, maybe that's part of the discussion about a debt service fund strategy where, as opposed to within the general fund or within the highway fund, for example, when we're talking about new buildings, if we have a debt service reserve that is not only to service actual debt but decrease the need to take on future debt, we could present you with perhaps policy examples to do that. I believe Burnett County has one of those. I reached out to my colleagues, I think about a year ago, and that's my recollection. But certainly a great piece to add to that conversation on fund balance when we get to that, probably next year, I would imagine.
Any other thoughts, comments? If not, I think it's always helpful to reflect on what we went through and try to have a continuous improvement process. And I'd like to thank the administrator and finance department and department heads for their work on this year's budget. I think at the end of the day, we have a good budget, and we can continually look for ways to improve it. So thank you. So we'll move on to the next educational discussion, and it's the fund balance policy review. And the administrator referenced discussions that he's had with the finance director relative to getting our arms around it. And I just thought it was important for us because it's dominated the discussion at the last two budgets on how do we use that dollars, what's the purpose of it. And the administrator and I have had a brief discussion, but what I'd like to see us work toward is a clarification of, for each of the funds, what is the purpose, what's the authority, where's the code resolution creating it, what are the restrictions on its use, when was it created, what are the inflows that go into it, how are the funds distributed, what is spendable, restricted, assigned, working capital, other, and unassigned, sort of what have we spent down, what's the current balance, what's been the historic balance going back a few years, and then looking at, how have we spent that in the 2004, we made commitments from reserve, we made it again in 2025, where are we relative to the balances at the end of that process? But what I'd like to try to do is get at the general fund, social improvement funds, park funds, grant fund, debt service, capital improvement, highway, solid waste, employee benefit, property and casualty, and any other significant fund, but that would be the basis. Any thoughts as we approach this, if that makes sense? And the hope would be that we generate perhaps a page on each one of the funds explaining what its purpose is, and then we would have a summary sheet with the financial data that we could update on an annual basis. So we don't have to go back under the underlying description of what the fund is, but have a different approach. Administrator Leonard, you want to comment?
That was kind of the conversation that Sam and I had. I mean, I refer to the Wisconsin Counties Association Green Book a lot as a thing you flip open, as Supervisor Hart just grabbed it. That idea of flip it open and have a page, or probably more likely two, on each reserve to get at a lot of the things you just referenced, including that historical usage. then also a summary page in some form other than an audited financial, because they're not the easiest things to read. And we can build off what I think was, I mean, I got a lot of good comments on the memo that we sent out. It was just late in the game, and I apologize for that, but we'll do better in getting that more on the front end of, hey, these are the funds. Let's talk about how you've historically used them. Here are the controlling policies, and during that time we can do the cleanup to the plain language. But then get that shared understanding and get that direction and kind of how we're going to go much earlier in the process. But I think we'd be well served. If nothing else, just rewrite them, like Supervisor Marshall referenced before about your tax delinquent property divestment ordinance, section 3.20. These things could use a cleanup to anything that is generally drafted and hasn't been touched since the 90s, or very little touch since the 90s, I think is ripe for the board to take a look at, because if nothing else, let's clean it up, own it, and have that shared understanding moving forward. But I agree wholeheartedly with kind of how you had that laid out.
Chair Gibbs.
Yeah, the one thing that I think we need to also include in fund balance policy is we have 4 other entities that we're either partner in or a major potentially fiscal agent for that potentially has risk and or potentially has reward, namely the airport, solid waste, NCHC, and ADRC. So I think when we start to have those discussions about fund balance policy, I think we need to weave into that discussion, how does the potential requirement that the county fund any shortfalls in, we already know about one of the shortfalls, and it's being addressed or potentially trying to be addressed by the solid waste committee. But there's also a plan and budget for the airport, but we know that there's potential challenges and opportunities there. So I think we need to include in our overall view and discussion about fund balance policies is how do those entities also provide risk and or reward to the county.
So you've just expanded it further, but other thoughts? And again, we wanted to see if we captured, if we're heading in the right direction in terms of discussion. We'll have one of those discussions on December 5th with the Infrastructure Committee relative to the Highway Reserve Fund as part of our joint meeting. But does that make sense from an approach? Silence is consensus. And again, it'll be an ongoing process, and we welcome input throughout. All right. Now, Sam, if you'd like to go into the third quarter financial updates.
So in the packet, again, I reran the year-to-date budget reports through September 31st of 2024, which should have everything in there. So a couple of late entries that were corrected. Most of the departments and the funds are where I expect them to be at this time of year, with the exception of the grants fund. Now, take into consideration the carryovers have not been entered in there, and under the grants fund, there was no budget in there for the ARPA grants. So that's why you see such an influx in there. I'm not concerned about it at this time. Does anybody have any specific questions related to any of the reports?
Supervisor Lambert, go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'm still digging, but could you just help me understand the process of looking at these sheets. When I see, for instance, the sheriff's department, it looks like they're, $18 million in the hole, but then you look at some other ones like the treasurer's department, they're $47 million above the hole. So clearly, there's some lack of understanding on my end to how to interpret these reports. I'm glad you say they're good, because from my mind, I'm like, what?
Yeah, absolutely. And next month, what you'll see is you'll just, again, a snapshot version, so you don't have to dig through everything unless you so choose to do so. But let's go ahead and flip over to the sheriff's department. So when you look at this, where we're looking at in the beginning is the expenditure budget. So statutorily, we accept the expenditure budget, and that's what they're supposed to remain within. So they're under total expenditures, they're at 75.95%. Now, when you look at their revenues, it says that they're supposed to have $3,008,672, of which they're at 73%. Now, the one thing that's not in this budget, which I'm hoping to change for 2025, is you don't see the levy that's been assigned to there. So when you look in that first column, the amended budget, that negative number on the net change, that's how much tax levy was assigned to there. So in the treasurer's department, that's where all of the levy is being carried. My hope in the future is to have the offset to the tax levy in a non-departmental and change the treasurer's department into an actual operating budget like everyone else. And then assigning those levy amounts in there so that your expenditures do match your revenues, and you can see that, so that it does not look like they're $18 million in the hole. But then we can kind of take a look at that and see, are they, in this case, they do collect housing for inmates. Where are we on that budget? Are we high? Are we low? So that you guys can make more informed decisions in the future based on those numbers.
Yeah, I hope
I think it's important, though. In the treasurer's office, all of the taxes flow through them, and I think people need to understand that. So they're going to show a surplus each and every year because they're the receiver of those assets. It doesn't mean that they went out and generated this. It was generated through the levy and in the collections. I think if you don't understand it, there's a good chance that a lot of other county board members don't. So please, as we're going through those, ask the questions, and if we've got a lot of them, it might be even good for us to do a frequently asked questions sheet on parts of the budget.
So to that point, that's the way we've always done it. We're going to change that for the reason the chair just referenced. It has made historically, it's been a bit of a challenge to look at. Not that I'm picking on the treasurer's office. It's a great example, though, for the reason you just gave. It's a bit more cumbersome to dive into what does the operation of the treasurer's office look like when it's, hey, you got $59 million in tax levy flowing in. They look like that's the department. They're doing amazing, and they are doing great work, but they're the ones collecting the money. Similarly to the Register of Deeds, if you look at their budget, they are bringing in revenue because that's a large part of the work that they do. And you referenced, Mr. Chair, the sheriff's office. You look at that, and they spend money very well because things are expensive in law enforcement. And then you have a lot of departments in the middle. Jamie in the back. There's revenue she brings in, but at the same time, generally speaking, if you think about all your true publicly accessible parks without user fees, those don't generate revenue. There's a levy offset. So I think Sam's strategy and her talking to me, I wholly support this idea of creating that non-departmental where the tax levy flows into, and then having tax levy actually entered in as a specific revenue for all of the departments. So when you get to the bottom, you'll see first and foremost that it's zero. Revenues equal expense, as opposed to it's the same information, it's just presented in a way that, like I referenced before, plain language. I think the future state that we've talked about is more of a plain language. I understand how this budget is meant to work. I see 0 at the bottom, revenues equal expense, as opposed to I see a negative 18 million. I infer then that 18 million is the tax levy allocation to that department. So we wholeheartedly agree with you that that's a change we can make to how to reflect those monthly financials. And I think Sam, we'll share it at your next meeting. She just, we talked about it just before this, immediately prior to this meeting. That summary sheet to really show you just percentage-wise on your expenditures, budget to actual, where they are through the year, I think will be helpful to give you that kind of pulse check throughout the year. It's not precise, but it's accurate because, for example, we were talking about the capital improvement spending. A lot of bills come in late in the year, really late in the year, and some we pay next year. Whereas those things don't always line up, and payroll is pretty regular. So we can get a good cadence, but your observation about how to read the financials is spot on. I mean, the thing that is the biggest variance that I always look for is personnel, which gets at the underlying philosophical conversation you need to have about how to budget. And when where we can get out of hand is if we have personnel costs, whether that's overtime costs or if people need to hire those short-term employees to fill need. I want to make sure, hey, we're through September. Sam ran the report this month, but all the expenses through September, payroll should be right around, if you're at the high end, you're at that 75-ish% payroll. You'll see in other departments where perhaps they had grant spending early. It could be an explanation, but you also get a good sense of where the attrition is. Conversely, it's where the overtime could be.
Speaking of personnel budgets, when you do look at these reports, one thing that may catch your eye, because particularly you may look at the budget used, is under the employee benefits line for all of the departments. It's extremely high because that's the wellness credit. The budget wasn't put in there. It was most likely put into the employer contributions. So we'll work on correcting that to make sure that it's accurately reflected for the future as well. But nothing to panic about. Again, it's just the wellness credit in that mapping.
Other questions? Thank you for that update. We look forward to future updates and learning more.
Thank you.
All right. Our next, I'm going to just spend some time talking about our next meeting. Based on the discussion we had at the last meeting, the decision was to have a painful meeting on December 5th, a long meeting. We'll actually have two separate meetings, one with infrastructure, that will focus in on the highway fund reserves and the facility. So the facility discussion will probably take place first, in so much as that will enlighten the discussion relative to what the reserves are in 4. And then we'll have a joint meeting with Extension Education Economic Development Committee, and that will focus in on the future of UW Stevens Point, WASA or UWMC, and as well as beginning to talk about the next steps relative to the tax increment finance task force and where are we going. I know that a number of you have been very interested in that, and in light of the fact that there are probably 3 committees, executive and us and EEDC, that will have a role relative to TIF policy, depending upon whether it's local or a change in the statutes. But we'll talk about those items, and if there are other items that are potential joint topics, we'll do that. But I would imagine that there'll be some lengthy discussion on the facility and where we're going with that, and then the policy, and then there's been a work group that was put together by UW Stevens Point that includes the administrator, Chair Morash, and myself as the chairs of the standing committees, as well as the Chamber, Greater Wausau Partnership, the City of Wausau, and the foundation, and others to sort of have a vision for the future. We'll share that. But I think there was some very eye-opening discussions relative to the cost of running that facility. The university's only using 21% of the facility right now, and I think we need to explore what our future options are. I know the Parks Department has looked at the field house as a community resource, and we just have to have that discussion and know where we are. We look at it from the facility perspective and budgeting perspective and capital expenditures or investments, and the EEDC looks at it from a programmatic and economic development perspective. So I think it'll be helpful to blend those committees and have that discussion going forward. But that will be the 5th. We will not meet then on the 11th, but I think that we probably will need to do catch up on we'll have that meeting right before the county board in December, so we're not calling you in for a separate one. So on the 17th, we'll plan on meeting. Perhaps at that time we can get at the easements and other things and look at those, but probably year-end close out in some of our backlog. So that would be the intent going forward. Any other items that you'd like to see us address? Questions? If not, that would take us to item 9. What are your wishes? Moved to adjourn by Chair Gibbs, seconded by Supervisor Marshall. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no. Thank you all. We are adjourned. Here's what I sent you. You don't want paper. Electronic. You have it electronically.
I think that's really